Segment 4, ain't gonna study war no more. I'm quoting from one of the first essays in here.
Yeah.
My advisor, you write,
Yeah.
when you were looking around at Stanford as a graduate student for someone to advise you on a paper on ancient Greece, my advisor was skeptical of your project. He knew better than I the prevailing attitudes in the scholarship of the times, close quote. What was it that you wanted to do that it prompted such skepticism?
Well, I had a very narrow education. I was a philologist where we had to study Latin and Greek manuscripts, basically. The program I was in, it was in philology. So I wanted to study war, how I didn't think people in the Peloponnesian War, any war, really achievements by the standard tactic of ravaging the countryside to force the enemy to fight them. So I mentioned this
because
to my...
you knew as a farmer from the Central Valley how hard it is to ravage.
Yeah, you'd see Thucydides or Herodotus or Xenophon, the ancient historians would say they cut down the trees and burn the grain, and everybody was writing, okay, the enemy was devastated economically. And I suggested, no, they weren't, because that's very hard to do. It's hard to light green grain or cut down a 12-foot in diameter olive tree, but they were prompts or instigations to get the enemy army to come out. So that was the emphasis. But my advisor, this was in the post-Vietnam period, was saying, you know what, military history, look at the jobs. There are no jobs in military history. Do you really want to be stigmatized instead of a philologist that studies Aristophanes or Thucydides, some right-wing nut that studies war?
Why? Why did the Academy turn against the study of war?
I don't know. I think a lot of it had to do with Vietnam in particular in the 70s and 80s. That's when you really saw the decline in academic programs. But there was a larger notion of social science. Social science had taught us that the nature of man is perfectible and it's changing. That you, with certain techniques, certain educational ideologies, you could change the way people are. His hard wiring, his brain chemistry would change in such a way he'd be peaceful. So as military history declined, we had something called peace and conflict resolution studies. To such a degree, I think that we have about 30 programs in military history and about...
In the country?
Yes, and about 200 peace and conflict resolution programs. And yet we know that the United Nations or the League of Nations has never stopped any war.
Victor, you note...
maybe to interrupt
I'm sorry,
you.
go ahead.
As a prominent conservative that was on the barricades during the Cold War, you know that today Taiwan does not exist because of the UN. South Korea does not exist because of the UN. They exist because of U.S. military deterrence. That's clear to everybody. And the idea that the United Nations would save Taiwan in extremis is lunatic.
Yeah, and you also make this really provocative point in The Father of Us All, quote, the university's aversion to the study of war is out of step with popular culture, which displays extraordinary enthusiasm for many things military, as witnessed the bestsellers by Stephen Ambrose, David McCullough's book on Truman, which deals a great deal with his conduct of the final stages of the Second World War. Your books, which sell beautifully.
Peter, if we walked right over to the Stanford bookstore or the Stanford catalog and looked at it, we would see gender studies, gender studies, gender studies, anything with studies, leisure studies, gender studies, race studies, environmental studies. And keep that in mind. And now if we walk right down University Avenue to Borders Books, you'll see
commercial enterprise.
Yes, commercial enterprise. You'll see something that says military history, and you can't even get near there.
Shelf after shelf.
Shelf after shelf. You'll see the studies that nobody, and it's very tiny, because people, whether we like it or not, are naturally attracted to these awful incidents where people are willing to wage their life for a principle, good or bad. So military history is in the dark hearts of us all. And so what's happened is, when the university shunned that as an academic discipline...
Hang on. Aren't you making a terrible concession when you say that it's in the dark hearts of us all? Aren't you already conceding the point to those who wish military history didn't exist, that it's this kind... You argue here that military history, military education properly understood, is not merely a necessary evil. We need to know this in order to make war less worse.
Just like
you argue it can be ennobling.
Yes, because look, the person who studies cancer, the oncologist, is not a bad person.
Right.
He understands cancer and tumors because he wants to find how to stop them. But the oncologist does not think that one day he's going to wake up and there's going to be no cancer. He understands there are always going to be cancers, at least for our lifetime, and he's going to try to thwart them. The directive of the military historian is not that you like war, it's organized murder. What you like about the field is to study it and to tell people that as awful as it is, and as it was with us in the beginning, it may be with us in the end, there are protocols in the past that allow us to get through it and mitigate its effects. If you have a strong deterrent and you can suggest to a rogue nation, an outlaw nation, a bellicose nation, I wouldn't do that if I were you, because the consequences are going to be so terrible you would not like that. If you can send that message, then you don't end up with a Philip of Macedon, or you don't end up with a Hitler, or as a member of the Reagan administration, you realize that Jimmy Carter's approach simply didn't work. Right. It doesn't work.
A quotation, then a couple of facts. The quotation from the father of us all. Most notable Greek writers, thinkers, and statesmen, from Aeschylus to Pericles to Xenophon, had served in the phalanx or in a trireme at sea, and such experiences permeated their work. Close quote. Yes. That's the quotation. Now, two facts. Here's one. In the United States today, those who enlist in the military come disproportionately from the poor. Yes. And those who become officers come disproportionately from the Midwest and above all from the South.
Yes.
Now here's the question. Whereas the leading figures of Greece all understood the military from first-hand experience, American elites, Northeast, coastal California, can lead their entire lives without brushing up against military culture, let alone military experience. Is this something new in American history, and is this healthy?
Well, I mean, we've had people who have not had a lot of military. I mean, Abraham Lincoln was in the Black Hawk War for a few weeks. FDR was Secretary of the Navy. So we've had people, but what the difference is that this is the first time that we've had commanders-in-chiefs either have not had military experience or they haven't had anything comparable. What I mean by anything comparable, anything from the underbelly of American life. Anybody who's had to take apart an engine, anybody who's had to build a house. So there are approximate experiences, not the same, but there's a tragic sort of notion that you're in a dead-end job, you have to work with muscular strength, there's no good and bad choices, bad and worse choices. All of that tragic view is necessary to understand what war is. But yeah, I'm afraid that in a very sophisticated technological society, we are certifying excellence, and this is a larger topic, expertise based on basically an Ivy League credential, which is not commensurate with real experience in the real world. It doesn't really tell us what somebody in Fallujah is thinking about. It's what saves the United States when it goes to war is that we have a subset of the population, for a variety of reasons, enlisted in officer corps that are 19th century in mentality. They live according to the protocols of the 19th century. What do I mean? They're more likely to believe in a transcendent religion. They're more likely to believe in nationalism. They're more likely to believe that, in a tragic view, that you can be good without having to be perfect, so they don't become depressed or inordinately give up because of an error. They are more likely to have had experience with muscular matters. And so their military really hasn't changed since the 19th century. The people who are ordering it and organizing it and auditing it have changed greatly. But so far, they're sort of like stuck in amber. And they've been a great salvation to the United States.